How's it going, guys? Welcome to my third Deathmatch Civilization overview, and this time I am going to be looking at the Byzantines. They're not considered one of the best civilizations for Deathmatch. However, I would suggest that any new player use this civilization for Deathmatch or for otherwise, because it is a civilization that is a very open tech tree, meaning almost any strategy you go for will be able to work because you have the units available in order to fulfill that strategy. Let's take a look. Now, before I actually get into the video, I'd like to ask all my viewers to take a poll that's going to be on the top right-hand corner of your screen, and this poll determines what civilization I will overview next. And right now I'm thinking that I'll either do the Franks, Huns, Mongols, or Turks. I want to start to experiment with doing it this way, because there are some civilizations I want to do, but I also want to do what my viewers want to do in order to provide the best content. And now for the Byzantines tech tree. The first bonus is that their buildings are plus 10% HP in the Dark Age, 20% in Feudal, 30% in Castle, and 40% in the Imperial Age. However, I would like to point out that the Byzantines get neither of the building HP upgrade technologies, which are masonry and architecture, which means that in the post-Imperial Age versus a civilization with both of these, it's more like plus 20% HP. However, this still does make a difference, so let's look at a test to see what that difference is. So I have 5 castles stationed here. One castle has no upgrades, so it's an Aztec castle. Another castle has only masonry, another has masonry and architecture, another has masonry, architecture, and hoardings, and the last one is the Byzantine castle. The non-upgraded one took 10 trebuchet shots to take down. The masonry-only one took 12. Architecture made it only 13 shots. However, I would like to point out that if you have 6 trebuchets attacking, that would take one more volley to take it out. Hoardings gives castles plus 20% HP, and a castle that has all 3 of these takes 15 shots to take down, and the Byzantines take 17. However, keep in mind that the masonry and architecture that the Byzantines lack would give the castles armor, and this means that against a lot of small attacks, such as a group of paladins, a Byzantine's castle is actually weaker than a castle with masonry, architecture, and hoardings. And it appears that in some situations, lower HP buildings are still affected more by masonry and architecture than by the Byzantine bonus. The next Byzantine bonus is that Camels, Skirmishers, and Halberdiers cost minus 25%. This bonus is nice because the cheaper Camels and Halberdiers are a great counter against Cavalry, the cheaper Skirmishers are a great counter against Archers, and as we will see later, the Byzantines have some other really good answers to counter Infantry. And this is what makes probably the Byzantines the quintessential jack-of-all-trades civilization. Having their fire ships have plus 20% attack is an interesting bonus, because it does make their fire ships a lot more effective than another civilizations. However, it is still important to note that the galleon is still the most important late-game water unit. And as we will see, the Byzantines also do well on the water. However, this is not that big of a bonus. Advancing to the Imperial Age costing minus 33%, and having free town watch is a bonus that I don't care about because I play Deathmatch and I start in post-Imperial Age. I suppose that this has some uses, however, I am not the source to go to find what these uses are. The Byzantine unique unit is the Cataphract. It is an anti-infantry unit because it deals plus 18 bonus damage to infantry units when it is fully upgraded, and it has a plus 16 defense against anti-cavalry attacks. And what this means is that many of the traditional counters against cavalry units do not apply nearly as well as they normally do. It is generally countered by archers or just any brute force units. However, there are no strong counters against it. There are only soft counters. Its biggest weakness is its cost, which is 70 food and 75 gold, and this makes it expensive to field. Now, I've already looked in depth into this unit in a previous video. However, in that video I made two mistakes. The first mistake is that I stated that it has a plus 16 bonus damage versus infantry, when in reality the elite Cataphract with the Logistica tech has the plus 18 bonus damage. I also incorrectly stated that pikemen do plus 4 bonus of damage against them, when in reality they do plus 6. This was just simply a math error on my part. Now, the Byzantine unique tech Logistica is interesting because it gives the Cataphract trample damage, and what this does is if a Cataphract is attacking an enemy unit, any adjacent enemy units to that Cataphract will get 5 damage. This is very important because in groups of units it makes the Cataphract very strong. For example, when fighting Halberdiers that are missing the last armor upgrade, it can take only 2 hits to kill a Halberdier if the Halberdier has suffered from a previous trample damage, and this can really affect the outcome of a fight. The new unique tech for the Byzantines that was added in the HD expansions is Greek Fire, and this gives their fire ship plus 1 range. I like this unique tech because it goes in line with their other bonus. However, keep in mind that still galleons rule the seas. However, this is a nice addition which makes their fire ships even more viable. Their team bonus is that monks heal 50% faster, and I don't think that this is really that big of a deal. However, it is nice if you're trying to keep those expensive Cataphracts alive. And now I'm going to give a brief overview of the tech tree itself. First thing to note is that their archers are fully upgraded in that they have the arbalest, the hand cannoneer, and the heavy cavalry archer. And this is a common theme that you're going to see with the Byzantine tech tree. They are also missing no blacksmith techs. However, they don't have any significant bonuses other than the skirmisher costing less, and they are missing Parthian tactics, which means that they don't have top tier archers, but their archers are above average. It's a similar story for their infantry. They have the halberdier, they have the champion, and their halberdiers are cheaper. However, they do miss that last blacksmith attack upgrade, meaning that their champions simply cannot compete with another civilizations. And the only time I would suggest that you make them is if you're countering a civilization that has eagle warriors, or maybe they're sending huskarls at you or something like this. And this means that their barracks is average, however still keep in mind that they do have better than average halberdiers. Their cavalry though is a lot more difficult for me to evaluate, because while they do have the hussar, the paladin, cheaper heavy camels, and that awesome cataphract, they miss bloodlines and the last attack upgrade, which makes almost all of their cavalry units subpar, except for maybe the heavy camel. And what this means is that while they do have an amazing array of options, they can't use those options to their fullest extent because that cataphract is so expensive. And what this results in is that you cannot press your cavalry advantage to the point that a real cavalry civilization would be able to. And what this means is that the Byzantines do have above average cavalry, however they're not quite top tier. I really wanted to give them a highly above average grade, but I just think that this is not fair considering the fact that their paladin and their hussar and their other units are just so weak when compared to another cavalry civilizations. As I'll talk about later though, having these options is a really good plus for the Byzantines. Now the Byzantines do have the siege ram and the bombard cannon for their siege workshop. However, they miss heavy scorpion, siege onager, and most importantly, they miss siege engineers. And what this is a university tech that gives their siege weapons a little bit more range, +1 range in fact, and it makes them do more damage to buildings. So my thoughts are basically that the bombard cannon and the ram are nice, but their trebuchets, their bombard cannon, and critically their onager lack range that most civilizations have. Because To be honest, guys, the most civilizations in Age of Empires 2 have siege engineers. And what this means is that their siege is simply average. And just in case any of you are bold enough to doubt my words, here is Spirit of the Law.
So they can certainly get by, but it's an average siege.
Ha! That proves it!
Considered.
You see, Spirit of the Law is by far the most reliable source for all things Age of Empires 2. What? I take it back! I take it back! I didn't mean to say that! He is the worst Age of... Oh, okay. He's good. He's good. He's a good YouTuber. I like him enough. Now, the Byzantine navy is probably one of the better navies in the game. They have all of the dock techs, they have bracer, and the only thing they miss is heated shot. So they have one of the most open tech trees in the game, as we have said a lot previously. However, their bonus for the fire ships really isn't substantial enough to make them top tier, and as such, the Byzantines have above average navy. However, any of my other viewers will be saying, wait, hold on a minute. The Koreans do have a significant bonus. They have the elite turtle ship, the most population efficient ship in the game, and in a team game, one of the best ships that you can make because it is effective from a standpoint of wood. Why did you give them an above average grade? And my answer for that would be because I made a mistake and because I wasn't fully aware of how most civilizations are actually lacking more techs in the dock than the Koreans were. And as such, I have to change the Koreans' grade that I gave them previously to highly above average, because from a deathmatch perspective, they do have one of the better navies in the game, and I just have to say this right here. Now, I promise I'm done talking about other civilizations. The Byzantines' defenses are very strong because they have the bombard tower, they have extra HP buildings, and they have really cheap counter units. And you have to remember that they have this wide open tech tree, which means that no matter what your opponent throws at you, you're going to have multiple options to counter that. And I think that this is the main big part about defenses. However, I don't think that they have any overwhelming bonuses or any overwhelmingly strong army compositions that are very hard to defeat. And as such, they do not have the best defenses in the game, but their defenses are highly above average. But I do have to address another previous mistake, again in the Korean civilization overview. In that overview, I said, now I think that they lack the building health of the Byzantines, and they lack the versatility of that civilization as well, which is probably why I did not give the Koreans the best grade. However, while Byzantines do have that versatility in being able to counter almost anything that you throw at them in multiple ways, I do need to point out that yes, that is true, but the Koreans are just so strong, and I have found that they are just the hardest civilization to attack in a deathmatch game. And if they're the hardest to attack, that means therefore the Koreans and not the Byzantines deserve the best defenses in the game grade. I'm sorry about these mistakes that I have previously made, but I do need to address these. And lastly, for the tech tree, I'm not going to grade their economy or their monastery because I wouldn't know how to grade those, but basically the Byzantines lack no economy techs, and their monastery is better than many other civilizations because they have almost all the techs available to them. And now for the deathmatch strategy portion of this video. Now, the Byzantines are very interesting when it comes to the early game, because they have access to both the Paladin and the Heavy Camel, meaning when they're playing against other civilizations that don't have access to either of these, they will have a superior rush, and in a deathmatch game, you should go for this rush. However, please note that their rush will be defeated by any civilization that is really strong in their rush, such as the Huns, the Franks, or the Goths. So keep this in mind. And just for clarification, the rush in a deathmatch game is not the same as a rush in a normal Age of Empires 2 game, because deathmatch starts at post-Imperial Age with a lot of resources. So the rush is very different. How you're going to want to start the early game is you're going to want to build a house, build military buildings, which will be a barracks if you're defending against an opponent's rush, or a stable if you're going to rush yourself, and then you're going to want to send those units towards your enemy's base if you're rushing, or keep them near your own if you're defending a rush. Also, try to get castles and town centers up as soon as you can as the Byzantines, because the Cataphract is such an important unit, and because the Byzantines' army costs a lot, so you need to get your economy up and rolling very fast. Now, what army you make after this is dependent on what civilization your opponent is, and on if you're in a 1v1 or in a team game. If you're going against archers, you'll of course want to make those elite skirmishers because they're a specialty of yours. However, keep in mind that they'll try to counter those elite skirmishers with either onagers or with paladins, or cavalry units like that. If they go for cavalry units, that's good because you can make camels to counter those cavalry units. But don't make halberdiers because those halberdiers will be countered by your opponent's archers. Now, this is of course situational and dependent on your opponent's units and on how much resources you have. However, keep in mind that those archers will counter your own halberdiers, which is a situation you don't want to be in, so camels would be the better choice. If your opponent instead makes onagers to counter those skirmishers, you're going to want to counter those onagers. You might be tempted to use the Cataphract because it's a good siege sniping unit because of its defense against halberdiers, but keep in mind that the Cataphract is also weak to your opponent's archers, which your opponent will already have, meaning it would be better for you to use the bombard cannon because it has further range and is not quite as weak as the Cataphract is. Your opponent will then make units to try to counter your second unit that you make, and you'll need to plan for that accordingly. And this really is the secret when playing as the Byzantines, which is to plan ahead and try to figure out what your opponent will make and have an option to counter this before they already make it. Countering infantry is your speciality as the Byzantines, and you'll probably want to make either hand cannoneers or cataphracts to do this. If you choose to go with cataphracts, you might want to back them up with skirmishers because your opponent will make those halberdiers to counter the cataphracts and archers to counter the cataphracts, which your skirmisher is a good unit to counter. If you instead choose to go with hand cannoneers, your opponents will make skirmishers to counter these, and then you might want to have paladins or onagers to counter those. Or if you have a lot of gold, just go for both hand cannoneers and for cataphracts. It can be a very devastating combo. The hand cannoneer does most of the heavy lifting, the cataphract does some work too, and when the enemy makes siege to attack those hand cannoneers, the cataphracts snipe those pretty well. Also add in some bombard cannons in there, and you're set to attack an infantry civilization. For countering cavalry, you can use those halberdiers or those cheaper heavy camels, and I would actually suggest that you use both because these two units are countered by different enemy units. So for example, the halberdier is countered by the skirmisher and the hand cannoneer, whereas the camel is countered mainly by enemy halberdiers. And this means that if you make both of these units, your enemies will have to make more units most likely to counter what you have. And, of course, you need to also add in other units to counter units that they make. However, this will be dependent solely on what your opponent is making, not on your civilization's bonuses themselves. When countering enemy siege, you just basically can use your own cavalry, such as hussars or cataphracts. You can also use the bombard cannons to counter siege, but be careful because enemies who have siege engineers can oftentimes outrange you. If your enemy instead decides to go for an infrastructure strategy full of bombard cannons, bombard towers, and trash units, you can counter with your own infrastructure strategy and with your rams. And I think that for countering a certain unit type, for the Byzantines there's no one best choice to make. It instead is dependent on what units your opponent is making. And this is both a strength and a weakness. It is a strength because it means you can technically counter anything that your opponent throws at you. But it's a weakness because you might not have that counter out at the right time, and because you need to have a lot of them out at once. What this means is that the best way to fight a Byzantines player is not by trying to counter his individual units, because a good Byzantines player will win the game of counters. But instead, you need to be the active player that sets the standard. Or in other words, you need to have a strong army composition with strong attacks that the Byzantine player is simply not ready for. There's no particular strategy in particular against the Byzantines that works really well. An infrastructure strategy can be great, but it can also be countered pretty easily. Your infantry, when used correctly, say if you play as the Goths and rush the Byzantines, can be very decisive and effective, but the Byzantines are still a great civilization for countering that. Archers can be useful, but again, they can be countered pretty easily. So instead, keep your army composition constantly changing, but constantly strong, that plays to your civilization's bonuses. So, those are basically my thoughts on the Byzantine civilization for a deathmatch game. They're a great civilization for players who like to be able to counter anything that their opponent throws at them, but they're not a great civilization for players who like one really strong strategy that will work against anything your opponent throws at you. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you have enjoyed this video. I'll see you later.